I never thought I'd be sitting in my attorney's office at 75, quietly disinheriting my own children. But as Jonathan Sterling slid the final documents across his mahogany desk, I felt nothing but relief. My sons had spent months whispering about my supposedly failing memory, planning my future behind my back, treating me like a burden they needed to manage. What they didn't know was that I remembered every cruel word, every dismissive laugh, every scheming conversation they thought I was too senile to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted me declared incompetent, so they could control the $12 million family business and my estate. Instead, their own words would become the evidence that sealed their fate. You see, while they thought I was forgetting things, I was actually remembering everything and writing it all down. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday at the Henley estate in Millbrook Heights. I was tending to my rose garden, the same roses my late husband Charles had planted for our 25th wedding anniversary, when I heard David's BMW pull into the circular driveway. My eldest son rarely visited during weekday mornings unless something was troubling him, so I wiped the soil from my hands and went inside to greet him. David stood in my kitchen, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from the drive, pouring himself coffee from the pot I'd made earlier. His wife Caroline sat at my breakfast table, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the wood. Neither of them had bothered to knock or announce themselves, a casualness that had become increasingly common since Charles passed 2 years ago. "Good morning, Mother," David said without looking up from his coffee. "We need to discuss some things about your living situation." I settled into my usual chair at the head of the table, the same spot where I'd presided over family dinners for 43 years. "What about my living situation concerns you, David?" Caroline exchanged a meaningful glance with my son before speaking. "Maggie, we've been noticing some changes lately. Small things, but they're adding up. The other day when we had dinner at Rosewood Country Club, you seemed confused about the time. And last week, you forgot about Tommy's birthday entirely." My heart quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. Tommy's birthday was still 3 weeks away, and I'd already ordered his gift. The dinner at Rosewood had been perfectly normal, except for the private conversation David and Caroline had conducted in hushed tones while I excused myself to the ladies' room. "I'm not sure what you mean about being confused." David set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Mother, you asked the waiter 3 times what day it was, and you kept repeating the same story about Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in her tree." This was completely untrue. I had mentioned Mrs. Henderson's cat once, in response to Caroline's question about our neighbors. As for asking about the day, I had simply confirmed our reservation time when there was confusion about our table, but I could see they had already constructed their narrative. "Perhaps I was just making conversation," I suggested mildly. Caroline leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use with children or the elderly. "Maggie, denial isn't helpful. These memory lapses are becoming more frequent. David and Tommy are worried about you living alone in this big house." The house was indeed large, a 6-bedroom colonial that had been perfect for raising 2 boys and hosting Charles's business associates. Now it felt cavernous at times, but it was my home, filled with memories and familiar routines that brought me comfort. More importantly, it was mine, legally and emotionally. "I've lived in this house for over 4 decades, I said carefully. "I know every inch of it. I'm hardly lost here." David pulled out a manila folder from his briefcase, the gesture too practiced to be spontaneous. "We've been researching some options. There's a wonderful facility called The Willows, about 20 minutes from here. It's more like a luxury resort than a traditional assisted living community." My stomach dropped. They hadn't just been discussing this, they had been planning it. "I don't need assisted living, David. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you? Caroline challenged. When was the last time you balanced your checkbook or managed your investment portfolio? You used to be so sharp with finances, but lately, you've seemed overwhelmed by paperwork. This was particularly galling because I had deliberately started asking David for help with certain financial matters, thinking it would be good to include him in family business decisions. His interpretation of my requests for collaboration as signs of incapacity revealed more about his mindset than mine. I've been involving you in financial discussions because I thought it was appropriate to keep family informed, I explained. Charles always said transparency was important in family businesses. But you've forgotten entire conversations we've had about Henley manufacturing, David pressed. Last month, you agreed to consider bringing in an outside management firm, and the next week, you had no memory of that discussion. I remembered that conversation perfectly. David had suggested hiring his friend's consulting company to modernize our operations, a change that would have cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars while potentially giving outsiders access to our proprietary processes. I had said I would consider it, not that I agreed to it, and my subsequent questions about the details had apparently been interpreted as forgetfulness rather than due diligence. I remember asking for more information about that proposal. I said, I never agreed to anything definitive. Caroline and David exchanged another look, the kind that suggested they'd anticipated this response. This is exactly what we're talking about, Caroline said with exaggerated patience. You're not remembering things accurately anymore. Tommy arrived while we were still talking, letting himself in through the back door as he always did. I ummed. Younger son had Charles's easy smile and gentle manner, traits that had made him popular in school and successful in his career as a pediatrician. But lately, there was something different about him, a distance that hadn't been there when his father was alive. Hey, Mom, he said, kissing my cheek before joining us at the table. David told me you guys were meeting this morning. So this had been coordinated in advance. The spontaneous nature of David's visit had been an illusion. They had planned this intervention, complete with research about assisted living facilities and prepared arguments about my supposed cognitive decline. Tommy, I said, reaching for his hand. I was just telling David and Caroline that I'm perfectly happy living. Here, I don't need assisted living. Tommy's expression grew troubled. Mom, I've been worried too. Last week when Victoria and I came for dinner, you seemed really scattered. You started 3 different stories and never finished any of them. And you put salt in the coffee instead of sugar. The salt incident had indeed happened, but it was because Victoria had rearranged my spice rack while helping in the kitchen, moving everything to locations that seemed more logical to her. I had grabbed what I thought was the sugar container in my own kitchen, only to discover she'd swapped the positions of several items. When I mentioned this, Victoria had laughed it off as helping Maggie get organized, but now that simple mistake was being presented as evidence of mental decline. Victoria reorganized my kitchen that evening, I reminded him. Everything was in different places than where I'd kept it for years. But you didn't remember that she'd moved things, Tommy said gently. You seemed genuinely confused about why the salt was where the sugar usually goes. This wasn't true either. I had been momentarily startled by the change, but I certainly remembered Victoria moving things. However, I could see that my family had decided to interpret every small confusion or surprise as a symptom of something larger. Caroline pulled out her phone, scrolling to what looked like a list of notes. There have been other incidents too. 2 weeks ago, you called David at 10 o'clock at night, completely disoriented about what day it was. I had called David that evening, but not because I was disoriented. I had been organizing Charles's old business files and found a contract that seemed important. When David answered groggily, I realized I'd lost track of time while working and apologized for calling so late. But apparently, My explanation about losing track of time while absorbed in paperwork had been interpreted as confusion about dates and time. I was working late and lost track of time, I said. That's not the same as being disoriented. But you kept asking what day it was, David insisted. You seemed genuinely unsure. What I had actually asked was whether his morning meeting was on Wednesday or Thursday, because I'd wanted to avoid interrupting his schedule when I called him back about the contract. But I could see that any clarifying questions I asked were being reframed as signs of confusion. Tommy leaned forward, his voice soft and concerned. Mom, we love you. That's why we're having this conversation. We want to make sure you're safe and well cared for. The sincerity in his voice almost broke my heart. If I hadn't been growing increasingly suspicious of these concerned visits, I might have been touched by what seemed like genuine worry. But too many small things weren't adding up. The way Caroline had notes on her phone about my supposed mistakes. The way David had come prepared with assisted living brochures. The way Tommy arrived exactly when expected, suggesting this was a planned intervention rather than a spontaneous family discussion. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully. But I'm not ready to leave my home. I feel perfectly capable of living independently. David's jaw tightened slightly, a tell. He'd had since childhood when he wasn't getting his way. Mother, being stubborn about this won't help anyone. The longer we wait to address these issues, the fewer options we'll have. What kind of options? I asked. Caroline glanced at David before answering. Well, if your condition deteriorates further, there might come a time when the decisions aren't entirely yours to make anymore. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They were suggesting that my supposed mental decline could eventually be used to override my autonomy entirely. The idea that my own children would consider having me declared incompetent was so shocking that for a moment I couldn't respond. Are you suggesting I might not have a choice in where I live? I asked quietly. Tommy looked uncomfortable. Mom, nobody wants it to come to that. But if you're not able to make safe decisions for yourself. Based on what evidence? I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Asking questions about business decisions? Being momentarily confused when someone rearranges my kitchen? Losing track of time while working on important papers? It's a pattern, David said firmly. Individual incidents might not mean much, but when you look at everything together— What pattern? I challenged. I volunteer at Grandview Memorial Hospital twice a week, and they've never expressed any concerns about my competence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I manage my household, maintain my garden, and handle my own correspondence. What pattern of incompetence are you actually seeing? The three of them fell silent, clearly not expecting me to push back so directly. I realized that they had anticipated a different conversation, one where I would be defensive about specific incidents rather than questioning their overall narrative. Caroline recovered first. Maggie, we're not attacking you. We're trying to help. The Willows really is a lovely place. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be staff available if you needed assistance. And you'd have social activities, other people your age to spend time with. I have plenty of social activities, I pointed out. I have book club with Helen Ashford and the other neighbors. I play bridge twice a week at the community center. I volunteer at the hospital. My social calendar is quite full. But those activities could continue, Tommy said. The Willows has transportation services. You could still do most of the things you enjoy. Most of the things I enjoyed. Not all of them. Not tending my rose garden, or hosting family dinners in my own dining room, or reading in Charles's old study surrounded by his books and memories. Not living in the space where I'd raised my children and built my marriage and created a lifetime of cherished moments. I don't want to live in an apartment in an assisted living facility, I said clearly. I want to live in my own home, which I've maintained successfully for decades. David's patience was clearly wearing thin. Mother, you're being unrealistic. This house is too big for you. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. I have a gardening service and a housekeeper, I reminded him. The same services I've used for 15 years. Nothing about my household management has changed. But the decision-making has become too much for you, Caroline insisted. All those financial papers, the business correspondence, the investment decisions. It's obviously stressing you out. Here was the crux of the matter. The financial papers and business correspondence weren't stressing me out. They were revealing information that my sons apparently didn't want me to understand clearly. Henley Manufacturing had been Charles's company, but I had inherited full ownership when he passed. David worked as the general manager, drawing a substantial salary, but I was still the owner and ultimate decision-maker. Lately, I had been taking a more active interest in the company's operations, asking questions about expenses and strategic decisions that I had previously left entirely to David's judgment. I don't find financial decisions stressful, I said. I find them important. Henley Manufacturing represents Charles's legacy, and I take my responsibility as owner seriously. But you don't understand the business like Dad did, David said, frustration bleeding into his voice. Some of the questions you've been asking don't make sense from an operational standpoint. The questions I'd been asking were about a series of large consulting contracts that David had authorized without my knowledge, payments to firms owned by his college friends and Caroline's family members. When I'd asked for documentation and explanations, David had seemed irritated rather than pleased by my interest in company oversight. I may not understand every operational detail, I acknowledged, but I understand enough to ask appropriate questions about significant expenditures and strategic changes. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, maybe it would help if you talked to someone professional about this transition. Dr. Meadows could recommend a geriatric specialist who could help assess what level of care might be appropriate. Dr. Patricia Meadows had been my physician for 20 years. She had never expressed any concerns about my mental acuity during our regular appointments. In fact, just last month she had commented on how sharp and engaged I seemed, particularly compared to other patients my age. Dr. Meadows sees me regularly, I said. She's never suggested that I need any kind of specialized care or assessment. But she might not be looking for subtle cognitive changes, Caroline said. A specialist would know what signs to watch for. They wanted me evaluated by a specialist who would presumably find the problems they were convinced existed. I was beginning to understand that this entire conversation was part of a larger strategy, one designed to establish a record of family concerns about my competence that could later be used to support more drastic measures. I think I'd like some time to consider what you've all shared with me today, I said, standing up from the table. This is a big decision, and I don't want to make it hastily. David looked annoyed by my refusal to commit immediately. How much time do you think you need? The Willows has a waiting list, and if we delay too long, you might not have the same options available. The pressure tactic was obvious, but I remained calm. I'll think about it and let you know in a few weeks. A few weeks? Caroline seemed alarmed. Maggie, we're worried about you living alone right now. What if something happens in the meantime? What do you imagine might happen? I asked. I've been living alone for 2 years since Charles passed, and I've managed perfectly well. But your condition is deteriorating, David said bluntly. Waiting a few weeks could mean missing the window when you're still competent to make this decision yourself. There it was again, the suggestion that my competence was temporary and fading, that if I didn't agree to their plan now, the choice might eventually be taken away from me entirely. I understand your concerns, I said diplomatically, but I need time to process this conversation and consider my options. The three of them exchanged looks that suggested this wasn't the outcome they'd hoped for. Tommy tried one more gentle approach. Mom, would you at least agree to tour the Willows, Just to see what it's like? You might find that it's more appealing than you imagine. I almost agreed, thinking that seeing the facility might help me understand their concerns more clearly. But something held me back, an instinct that agreeing to any part of their plan might be interpreted as acceptance of their basic premise that I needed assisted living. I'll consider it, I said noncommittally. After they left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the brochures David had left behind. The Willows looked pleasant enough in the glossy photographs, smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities, attractive apartments with safety features, professional staff providing assistance with daily tasks. But the whole presentation assumed that I needed assistance with daily tasks, an assumption that I fundamentally disagreed with. More troubling was the realization that my children had been building a case against my competence for weeks, or possibly months, documenting incidents and interpreting my behavior through the lens of cognitive decline. Every question I asked, every moment of confusion or surprise, every ordinary human mistake was being cataloged as evidence that I was losing my mental faculties. I walked through my house, really looking at it with fresh eyes. Was it too big? For me? Perhaps, but I used most of the rooms regularly. The formal dining room where I hosted book club meetings, the sunroom where I read every morning with my coffee, Charles's study where I managed correspondence and financial paperwork, the guest bedrooms where my grandchildren stayed during visits. Even if the house was larger than strictly necessary, it was my space, arranged according to my preferences, and filled with my belongings and memories. In Charles's study, I sat down at his old desk and opened the drawer where I kept my journal. For the past month, I had been writing down conversations and incidents, partly because I found that writing helped me process my grief, and partly because I was beginning to notice discrepancies between what I remembered and what my family claimed had happened. Looking at my notes from the past few weeks, I could see a pattern, but not the one my children were suggesting. The pattern I saw was of a family increasingly interested in my financial affairs and decreasingly interested in my autonomy. David's questions about Henley manufacturing had become more pointed. Caroline's suggestions about updating my will had become more frequent. Tommy's visits, while still warm and affectionate, now always seemed to include casual inquiries about my finances or my plans for the future. I opened a fresh page in my journal and began writing about this morning's conversation, recording as precisely as possible what each person had said and how they had said it. If my family was building a case against my competence, I needed to build my own record of what was actually happening versus what they claimed was happening. The phone rang as I was writing, and I answered to find Helen Ashford on the line. My neighbor and closest friend had been checking on me more frequently since Charles's death, but her calls were always welcome. "Maggie, I saw David and Tommy leaving earlier. Is everything all right?" Helen had known my boys since they were children, and she had a gift for reading family dynamics with uncomfortable accuracy. I hesitated, unsure how much to share, but my instinct was to be honest with her. "They're concerned about my memory," I said carefully. "They think I might need assisted living." There was a long pause before Helen responded. "Your memory? Maggie, your memory is better than mine, and I'm 5 years younger than you are. What on earth gave them that idea?" Her immediate dismissal of their concerns was both validating and troubling. If my supposed memory problems were obvious enough to warrant assisted living, surely Helen would have noticed them during our frequent interactions. "They've been documenting incidents," I explained. "Small things, but they say it's a pattern." "What kind of small things?" Helen asked, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice. I described some of the examples David and Caroline had mentioned, and Helen's response was swift and indignant. "That's ridiculous. You lost track of time while working on important papers. That's not memory loss, that's concentration. You were confused when someone rearranged your kitchen. Anyone would be. And asking clarifying questions about business decisions is prudent, not evidence of cognitive decline. Hearing Helen's perspective helped clarify my own thoughts. The incidents my family had described weren't actually signs of memory problems when viewed objectively. They were normal human experiences that had been reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion and concern. "Helen," I said slowly, "do you think they might have ulterior motives for wanting me in assisted living?" "Oh, honey," Helen said sadly. "I think that's exactly what this is about. Your house is worth over $1 million, and Henley Manufacturing is worth much more than that. If they can convince people that you're not competent to manage your own affairs." She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood the implications. If I were declared incompetent, my sons could potentially gain control over my assets, my business, and my living situation. The assisted living facility might be just the first step in a larger plan to manage my life and my money, according to their preferences rather than mine. "What should I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Helen advised immediately. "Keep a record of what they say and do. And maybe talk to a lawyer who specializes in elder law, someone who can explain your rights and help you protect yourself." After we hung up, I sat in Charles's study thinking about Helen's advice. The idea that I might need legal protection from my own children was heartbreaking, but the alternative, allowing them to gradually strip away my autonomy and independence, was worse. I pulled out the phone book and began looking for attorneys who specialized in estate planning and elder law. If my sons were building a case against my competence, I needed professional help to build a defense. More than that, I needed to understand exactly what my rights were and how to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children thought my memory was failing, but I was about to prove just how clearly I remembered everything they'd said and done. Every conversation, every suggestion, every subtle threat about my autonomy, it was all written down in my journal, a detailed record of their campaign to convince me and others that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back. Tonight, I would write down every detail of today's conversation while it was still fresh in my mind. If they wanted to question my memory, I would give them something to remember. The next morning, I called Jonathan Sterling's law office and scheduled an appointment for Friday afternoon. His secretary, a professional woman with a warm voice, assured me that Mr. Sterling specialized in estate planning and elder rights, exactly what I needed. I spent the rest of the week quietly observing my family's behavior with new eyes, documenting every interaction in my journal. Wednesday brought an unexpected visit from Victoria, Tommy's wife. She arrived around noon with a casserole dish and her usual bright smile, but I noticed she seemed more interested in surveying my house than in our conversation. While I made tea, she wandered through my living room, straightening cushions and rearranging magazines with the air of someone taking inventory. "Maggie, this house really is enormous for one person," she commented, running her finger along my mantelpiece as if checking for dust. "Don't you find all these rooms overwhelming to maintain?" I watched her carefully as I set the teacups on my coffee table. "I have Mrs. Patterson come twice a week for cleaning, just as I have for years. The house maintains itself quite well." Victoria settled into Charles's favorite armchair, the one I rarely sat in myself because it still felt like his space, but the emotional burden of being surrounded by so many memories must be difficult. Sometimes a fresh start can be healing after loss. Her words were gentle, but there was something calculated about the way she was looking around my living room, noting the antique furniture and valuable artwork that Charles and I had collected over 4 decades of marriage. I began to suspect this visit wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared. "I find comfort in my memories," I said simply. "This house doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like home." Victoria nodded sympathetically, but continued her subtle interrogation. "Of course, but managing all the details must be exhausting. Tommy mentioned you've been having trouble with financial paperwork lately. This was interesting. Tommy had mentioned no such thing to me directly, which meant he and Victoria had been discussing my supposed difficulties in private. I decided to test how much information was being shared among my family members. What specifically did Tommy say I was having trouble with? I asked. Victoria looked momentarily uncomfortable, as if she'd revealed more than intended. Oh, just general things. You know how complex financial matters can be as we get older. He worries about you managing everything alone. I sipped my tea and waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed to realize she'd stepped into uncertain territory. Instead, she changed the subject to Tommy's work at the hospital, chatting about his patients and recent cases with the ease of someone trying to redirect an awkward conversation. After Victoria left, I made careful notes about her visit. She had asked specific questions about my ability to maintain the house, manage my finances, and cope with living alone. More tellingly, she had referenced conversations with Tommy about my supposed struggles, conversations that painted a very different picture of my capabilities than the reality I was living. Thursday evening brought the weekly family dinner at Rosewood Country Club, a tradition Charles had started when the boys were teenagers that had continued even after his death. I usually looked forward to these dinners, but tonight I approached the evening with new awareness, listening carefully to every word and watching every gesture. David and Caroline were already seated when I arrived, deep in conversation with Tommy and Victoria. They looked up as I approached, their discussion cutting off abruptly in a way that suggested they'd been talking about me. "Mother, you look lovely tonight," David said, standing to pull out my chair. "How was your week?" I settled into my seat and accepted the menu from our waiter, a young man named Marcus who had been serving our family for 2 years. "It was quite productive, thank you. I spent some time organizing Charles's old business files and found several interesting documents." The reaction was immediate and telling. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Caroline's smile became noticeably forced. "What kind of documents?" David asked with studied casualness. "Investment records, mostly. Some correspondence about company decisions from the past few years. I'm trying to get a better understanding of how Henley manufacturing has evolved since your father's death." This was true, though I hadn't mentioned that what I'd discovered was troubling. Several large payments to consulting firms that I didn't recognize, expense reports that seemed excessive, and a pattern of financial decisions that Charles would never have approved. I was beginning to understand why David seemed so eager to have me declared incompetent. "You know, Mother," David said carefully, "those old files might be confusing without proper context. The business has become much more complex since Dad's time. Maybe I should help you sort through them to avoid any misunderstandings." Tommy nodded in agreement. "Mom, some of those financial documents can be really complicated. You might be worrying yourself over things that are perfectly normal business practices." I smiled pleasantly while making mental notes about their responses. Both sons seemed very concerned about my reviewing company records independently, which was curious. Given that I was the owner of the company, "I find the documents quite illuminating, actually," I said. "Charles always encouraged me to understand our business interests, even if I wasn't involved in day-to-day operations." Caroline leaned forward, her voice taking on that familiar patronizing tone. "But Maggie, you might be remembering things differently than they actually happened. Memory can play tricks on us, especially when we're dealing with complex information." Here it was again, the suggestion that my memory was unreliable. But this time, I was prepared to test their claims directly. "Speaking of memory," I said conversationally, "I was trying to remember what we discussed at dinner last week. Caroline, didn't you mention something about your sister's wedding plans?" Caroline looked puzzled. "My sister isn't engaged, Maggie. I think you might be thinking of someone else." I nodded as if accepting her correction, but I knew perfectly well that Caroline had spent 20 minutes describing her sister's upcoming engagement party, complete with details about the venue, And guest list. Either Caroline was lying now, or she was testing my memory against false information. You're absolutely right, I said agreeably. I must be confused. Memory does play tricks sometimes, doesn't it? The comment seemed to relax everyone at the table, as if I'd confirmed their assumptions about my declining faculties. Victoria and Caroline exchanged a meaningful glance, while David looked almost relieved. As the evening progressed, I conducted similar small tests, referencing conversations and events that I remembered clearly, but describing them slightly incorrectly to see how my family would respond. In every case, they were quick to correct me and eager to attribute my mistakes to memory problems, even when I knew my original recollection was accurate. The most revealing moment came when Tommy casually mentioned Dr. Meadows during dessert. "Mom, when's your next appointment with Dr. Meadows? Victoria and I were thinking it might be good for one of us to come with you, just to make sure you're asking all the right questions about your health." I had seen Dr. Meadows just 2 weeks earlier for my regular checkup, and she had pronounced me in excellent health for my age. My next appointment wasn't scheduled for 3 months. "I don't have another appointment scheduled yet," I said truthfully. "But don't you usually see her every month or two?" Victoria asked. "At our age, regular monitoring becomes so important." This was completely false. I had always seen Dr. Meadows every 6 months unless there was a specific health concern, a schedule that had remained consistent for decades. The suggestion that I usually had monthly appointments was either a misunderstanding or a deliberate misrepresentation of my medical care. "I think every 6 months has always been sufficient," I said mildly. "Are you sure?" Caroline pressed. "It seems like you mentioned seeing her much more frequently than that." I was absolutely certain about my medical appointment schedule, but I could see that my family was prepared to question even basic facts about my own healthcare routine. The pattern was becoming clear. Anything I said could be reframed as evidence of confusion or memory loss, regardless of its accuracy. After dinner, as we walked to our cars in the country club parking lot, David fell into step beside me. "Mother, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier this week. Have you given any more thought to visiting the Willows?" "I'm still considering my options," I replied diplomatically. His jaw tightened slightly, the same expression he'd worn as a child when he didn't get his way immediately. "I really think you should make a decision soon. The longer you wait, the more limited your choices become." There was an implied threat. In his words, the suggestion that if I didn't choose assisted living voluntarily, other arrangements might be made for me. I kept my voice calm and non-committal. "I understand your concern, David. I'll let you know when I've reached a decision." Friday afternoon, I sat in Jonathan Sterling's office feeling more nervous than I'd expected. His law firm occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Millbrook's historic district. Jonathan himself was younger than I'd anticipated, perhaps 50, with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Henley," he said, settling behind his desk after offering me coffee. "What can I help you with today?" I had rehearsed this conversation, but actually beginning felt daunting. "I'm concerned that my family may be trying to have me declared incompetent in order to gain control of my assets." Jonathan's expression remained professionally neutral, but he leaned forward slightly, giving me his full attention. "What makes you think that?" I opened my journal and began describing the pattern of behavior I'd observed over the past month. Jonathan listened without interruption as I detailed the accusations about my memory, the pressure to move to assisted living, the misrepresentations of my capabilities, and the increased interest in my financial affairs. When I finished, Jonathan was quiet for a moment, making notes on a legal pad. "Mrs. Henley, how would you describe your current mental and physical health?" "Excellent," I said without hesitation. "I had a complete physical 2 weeks ago. My blood pressure is normal, my cholesterol levels are good, and Dr. Meadows says I'm in better shape than most people my age." Mentally, I feel as sharp as I ever have. I manage my own household, volunteer at the hospital, maintain active social relationships, and take an increasing interest in my business investments. Jonathan nodded, continuing to make notes. Have you had any formal cognitive assessments or neurological evaluations? No, because no medical professional has suggested I need them. The only people expressing concerns about my mental capacity are family members who would benefit financially from controlling my assets. Tell me about your assets, Jonathan said. What exactly would they gain control of if you were declared incompetent? I described Henley Manufacturing, the family home, my investment portfolio, and the various accounts and properties I'd inherited from Charles. The total value was substantial, more than enough to motivate questionable behavior from people who believed they were entitled to inherit. Mrs. Henley, Jonathan said carefully, what outcome are you hoping for from our consultation today? I had thought about this question extensively. I want to protect myself from being declared incompetent based on false or exaggerated claims about my mental capacity. I want to ensure that any future decisions about my care or living situation are based on objective medical assessments rather than family pressure. And I want to make sure my assets are distributed according to my wishes, not according to what others think I should want. Jonathan spent the next hour explaining my legal rights and options. He outlined the process by which someone could petition for guardianship or conservatorship, the standards of evidence required, and the protections available to prevent abuse of the system. Most importantly, he explained how I could proactively document my competence and establish legal safeguards against unwanted intervention. I recommend we take several immediate steps, he said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. First, we'll arrange for you to have a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by an independent specialist. This will establish a baseline of your cognitive function that can't be disputed later. Second, we'll update your estate planning documents to reflect your current wishes and include specific provisions protecting against challenges based on alleged incompetence. Third, we'll create a detailed record of your daily activities and decision-making capabilities. The neuropsychological evaluation was scheduled for the following week with Dr. Amanda Richardson, a respected specialist who had no connection to my family or their medical contacts. Jonathan also arranged for me to meet with Grace Chen, a financial advisor who could review my investment decisions and provide an independent assessment of my financial management capabilities. Mrs. Henley, Jonathan said as our meeting concluded, I want you to understand that what you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Adult children sometimes convince themselves that they're acting in their parents' best interests when they're actually motivated by inheritance concerns or control issues. The good news is that you're taking proactive steps to protect yourself before any formal action has been taken against you. Driving home from Jonathan's office, I felt simultaneously relieved and saddened. Relief that I had professional support and a plan for protecting my autonomy. Sadness that such protection was necessary against my own children. But there was also something else, a growing sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt in months. That evening, David called to check on me, his voice carefully casual. How was your day, Mother? You mentioned you had some errands to run. I had told him I would be out Friday afternoon, but I hadn't specified what errands I was running. It was productive, I said. I accomplished everything I needed to do. That's good. You know, Caroline and I were talking, and we think it might be helpful for you to have someone accompany you on errands from now on, just to make sure you don't get overwhelmed or confused. The suggestion was presented as helpful, but the implication was clear. They wanted to monitor my activities and limit my independence. I wondered if they suspected I was seeking legal advice, or if this was simply the next step in their gradual campaign to control my life. I manage my errands quite well on my own, I said. I've been running my own errands for over 50 years. But things change as we get older, David pressed. It's not about capability, it's about safety. What if you had a medical emergency while you were out alone? I carry a cell phone and medical alert information in my wallet, I pointed out. The same precautions I've taken for years. Still, it would make us feel better if someone was with you, David insisted. Maybe Mrs. Patterson could expand her services to include running errands with you. Mrs. Patterson was my housekeeper, a lovely woman who had worked for our family for 15 years. But her job was cleaning my house, not supervising my activities. The suggestion that I needed supervision for routine tasks was both insulting and revealing. I'll consider it, I said, using the same non-committal response that seemed to buy me time without agreeing to anything specific. After we hung up, I added notes about David's call to my journal. The pattern was accelerating, increasing pressure, to limit my independence, growing insistence that I needed supervision and assistance, and mounting urgency about making decisions regarding my living situation and care. But now, I had something they didn't know about. Professional allies who understood my situation and were helping me build a defense against their campaign. Dr. Richardson would evaluate my cognitive function objectively. Grace Chen would assess my financial decision-making capabilities. Jonathan Sterling would ensure my legal rights were protected. Most importantly, I was documenting everything they said and did, creating a detailed record of their efforts to paint me as incompetent. If they wanted to question my memory, they would discover that I remembered every conversation, every suggestion, every subtle threat about my autonomy. The irony was perfect. While they whispered about my failing memory at family dinners, I was quietly building an unshakable record of their manipulation and control tactics. When the time came to defend myself, my supposedly failing memory would provide the most damning evidence against their credibility. Sunday morning brought another unexpected test of my memory and awareness. Tommy arrived for what he called a casual visit, but he brought with him a man I didn't recognize, a middle-aged professional in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Dr. Robert Harrison," Tommy said as they settled in my living room. "He's a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in memory disorders. I thought you might like to talk with him informally, just to get his perspective on some of the concerns we've discussed." I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced. This was clearly an ambush, an attempt to get me evaluated by a specialist without my consent or preparation. Dr. Harrison's presence in my home on a Sunday morning suggested this encounter had been planned in advance, despite Tommy's casual presentation. "How nice to meet you, Dr. Harrison," I said politely. "What brings you by today?" Dr. Harrison smiled with practiced warmth. "Tommy has shared some concerns about changes he's noticed in your memory and decision-making abilities. I thought it might be helpful to have a conversation about how you're managing daily activities." The phrasing was clever, designed to sound like friendly interest rather than a formal evaluation. But I recognized this for what it was, an attempt to create documentation of cognitive problems that could later be used to support claims about my incompetence. "I'm managing my daily activities quite well, thank you," I said. "In fact, I've been more active lately than I was immediately after my husband's death. Grief can be isolating, but I'm finding my way back to full engagement with life." Dr. Harrison nodded sympathetically. Grief can certainly affect cognitive function temporarily. Sometimes families notice changes that seem concerning, but are actually normal responses to loss. "Can you tell me about your typical day?" I described my routine in detail: morning coffee and newspaper in the sunroom, correspondence and bill paying. In Charles's study, volunteer work at the hospital, social activities with friends, evening reading or television. As I spoke, I watched Dr. Harrison's expression for signs of what he was really looking for. "That sounds like a full schedule," he said. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed by managing all these activities independently?" "Not at all," I replied. "I find structure and purpose helpful. Staying engaged keeps me mentally and physically active." Dr. Harrison asked several more questions about my memory, my decision-making processes, and my awareness of my own capabilities. Each question was phrased casually, but I could see the clinical framework underneath. He was conducting an informal mental status examination, testing my orientation, memory, and judgment while trying to maintain the pretense of friendly conversation. After 20 minutes, Dr. Harrison excused himself, claiming he had another appointment. Tommy walked him to the door, and I heard them speaking in low voices on my front porch before Dr. Harrison drove away. When Tommy returned to the living room, his expression was troubled. "Mom, Dr. Harrison thinks it might be good for you to have a more formal evaluation, just to establish a baseline and make sure everything is functioning normally." "Did he find something concerning in our conversation?" I asked innocently. Tommy hesitated. "Not exactly concerning, but he said some of your responses suggested you might be having subtle difficulties that a comprehensive evaluation could identify." This was interesting. Dr. Harrison had found problems where none existed, or he was willing to claim he'd found problems to support Tommy's preconceived narrative. Either way, it confirmed my suspicion that my family was building a case against my competence with the help of sympathetic medical professionals. "I appreciate Dr. Harrison's concern," I said carefully, "but I'm quite comfortable with my current level of functioning." Tommy sat down across from me, his expression earnest and worried. "Mom, what if you're not the best judge of your own capabilities? Sometimes cognitive changes are subtle, and the person experiencing them doesn't recognize them. Then I suppose objective testing would reveal the truth," I said. "If there really are problems, they would show up in formal evaluations." Tommy looked relieved, as if I'd agreed to something I hadn't actually committed to. "Exactly. Dr. Harrison could arrange for comprehensive testing with a neuropsychologist he works with regularly." I almost smiled at the transparency of this offer. They wanted me evaluated by a neuropsychologist who worked regularly with Dr. Harrison, someone who would presumably reach conclusions consistent with their preferred narrative. "I'll think about it," I said, giving Tommy the same response I'd been giving David about the Willows. After Tommy left, I called Jonathan Sterling's office and left a message about the unexpected visit from Dr. Harrison. I also made detailed notes about the conversation, including Dr. Harrison's specific questions and his claimed findings of subtle difficulties. The next day, Jonathan called back with concerning news. "Mrs. Henley, I did some research on Dr. Robert Harrison. He's testified in several guardianship cases in the past 2 years, always supporting the petitioners who wanted elderly relatives. Declared incompetent. He's developed something of a reputation for finding cognitive problems in situations where other specialists don't see them." This confirmed my worst suspicions. Tommy hadn't brought a neutral specialist to assess my capabilities. He'd brought someone with a track record of supporting family members who wanted to control elderly relatives. "What should I do?" I asked. "Document everything about yesterday's visit," Jonathan advised, "and don't agree to any evaluations arranged by Dr. Harrison or anyone connected to him. We'll stick with our plan to have you assessed by Dr. Richardson, who has no connections to your family." Tuesday brought my appointment with Dr. Richardson, and I approached it with confidence rather than anxiety. Unlike Dr. Harrison's ambush evaluation, this was a formal, comprehensive assessment conducted by a genuinely independent specialist who had no stake in the outcome. Dr. Richardson's office was professional but comfortable, and she explained each component of the evaluation before beginning. The testing took 3 hours and covered everything from basic orientation and memory to complex problem-solving and executive function. "Mrs. Henley," Dr. Richardson said as we concluded, "I'll have complete results for you within a week, but I can tell you preliminarily that your performance was excellent across all domains. Your memory, attention, and reasoning abilities are well within normal limits for your age, and actually above average in several areas." I felt a surge of vindication. "So there's no evidence of cognitive decline or memory disorders?" "None whatsoever," Dr. Richardson confirmed. You demonstrate the cognitive capacity to make complex decisions about your care, finances, and living situation. If anyone questions your mental competence, this evaluation will provide strong objective evidence to the contrary. Driving home from Dr. Richardson's office, I felt the pieces of my defense strategy falling into place. I had objective proof of my cognitive competence, legal representation to protect my rights, and detailed documentation of my family's manipulation tactics. But more than that, I was beginning to feel something I hadn't experienced in months: anger. Not the hurt confusion I'd felt when my children first started questioning my capabilities, but clear, righteous anger at their willingness to betray my trust and undermine my autonomy for their own benefit. They thought my memory was failing, but I remembered everything. Every casual cruelty, every manipulation disguised as concern, every attempt to make me doubt my own perceptions. I remembered, and soon I would make sure they understood exactly how much I remembered. Armed with Dr. Richardson's comprehensive evaluation confirming my cognitive competence, I began the third phase of what had become a careful campaign to protect myself. Jonathan Sterling had advised me to start demonstrating my capabilities publicly while documenting my family's continued attempts at manipulation. It was time to step out of the shadows and show the world exactly who Margaret Henley really was. My first move was to return to activities I had quietly abandoned during the initial months of grief after Charles's death. Wednesday morning found me at the Millbrook Community Foundation, where I had served on the board for 8 years before stepping back to care for Charles during his final illness. Martha Blackwood, the executive director, welcomed me back with genuine warmth. "Maggie, we've missed your insight and experience terribly," she said as we settled in her office overlooking the town square. "The scholarship committee hasn't been the same without your educational background." I had forgotten how much I enjoyed the intellectual challenge of reviewing scholarship applications and making funding decisions that would genuinely impact young people's futures. More importantly, Martha's immediate acceptance of my return contradicted my family's narrative that I was becoming increasingly incapable of handling complex responsibilities. "I'd like to increase my involvement," I told Martha. "Perhaps chair the scholarship committee this year, if the board would have me." Martha's eyes lit up. "That would be wonderful. The spring application review is coming up, and we have our largest applicant pool ever. Your expertise in evaluating academic potential would be invaluable." Within an hour, I had committed to chairing a committee that would review over 200 scholarship applications and make funding recommendations totaling nearly $500,000. The responsibility was substantial, requiring careful analysis of academic records, financial need assessments, and personal essays. It was exactly the kind of complex decision-making my family claimed I was no longer capable of managing. Thursday brought an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate my business acumen publicly. David had mentioned a board meeting for Henley Manufacturing scheduled for Friday morning, assuming I wouldn't attend as I rarely participated in operational discussions. But as the company owner, I had every right to be present, and I decided it was time to exercise that right more actively. I called David Thursday evening to inform him of my intention to attend. His reaction was immediate and revealing. "Mother, are you sure that's necessary? These meetings can be quite technical, and we'll just be discussing routine operational matters." As the owner of the company, I think it's important for me to stay informed about routine operational matters, I replied smoothly. "But you might find the discussions confusing," David pressed. "There are a lot of financial details and strategic projections that can be overwhelming if you're not following them regularly." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. My own son was suggesting I wouldn't be able to follow a discussion about the company I owned, despite my business degree and decades of involvement in Charles's various enterprises. "I'll manage," I said firmly. "Please ensure there's a seat for me at the table." Friday morning, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that conveyed both authority and professionalism. I arrived at Henley Manufacturing 15 minutes early, giving myself time to review the quarterly reports and financial statements that David had reluctantly provided when I requested them Thursday night. The conference room fell silent when I entered. David, Caroline, and 3 other board members were already seated around the polished oak table, their expressions ranging from surprise to concern. I took the empty chair at the head of the table, the position Charles had always occupied during board meetings. "Good morning, everyone," I said pleasantly. "Shall we begin?" The meeting that followed was illuminating in ways David hadn't anticipated. As I listened to discussions about consulting contracts, operational changes, and financial expenditures, patterns emerged that confirmed my suspicions about questionable business practices. When David presented a proposal for a $200,000 technology upgrade through a consulting firm called Meridian Solutions, I asked for additional details about the company's qualifications and previous work. David's response was vague and defensive, claiming the technical aspects would be too complex for me to understand. "I'd like to see Meridian Solutions' portfolio and references," I said calmly. "A $200,000 expenditure deserves thorough due diligence." "Mother, we've already done the research," David said, his irritation barely concealed. "The proposal has been vetted by our technical team. Then providing their portfolio and references shouldn't be difficult." I replied, "I'd also like to understand why we're not seeking competitive bids for such a significant contract." The room grew uncomfortable as David struggled to explain why sole source contracting was appropriate for this particular purchase. When pressed for details about Meridian Solutions' ownership, he finally admitted that the company was partially owned by Caroline's brother, a fact that had been conspicuously absent from his initial presentation. "I see," I said, making a note in my folder. "And has the board formally approved engaging vendors with family connections?" The silence that followed confirmed that no such approval had been sought. I could see the other board members exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation of potential conflicts of interest. "Perhaps we should table this proposal until we can review our vendor selection policies," suggested Frank Morrison, the board's longest-serving independent member. "It would be prudent to ensure we're following best practices for procurement." David's face darkened, but he nodded stiffly. "Of course, we can revisit this next quarter." The meeting continued with discussions of other operational matters, and I found myself asking pointed questions about several expense categories that seemed unusually high. Travel costs had tripled since Charles's death. Professional services fees had increased by 60%. Marketing expenditures had doubled without corresponding increases in revenue. When I requested detailed breakdowns of these expense categories, David's responses became increasingly evasive. He claimed the information was available but too complex to explain in the meeting format. He suggested that attempting to understand these details might be overwhelming for someone not involved in daily operations. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone present that I was asking intelligent, relevant questions about company operations and financial management. My supposed cognitive decline was nowhere in evidence. Instead, David's inability to provide satisfactory answers to legitimate oversight questions had made him appear defensive and unprepared. After the other board members left, David confronted me directly. "Mother, I don't understand why you're suddenly questioning every decision we make. You've never been involved in operational details before." "I've never been the sole owner before," I replied. "Charles always handled oversight, but now that responsibility falls to me. I'm simply fulfilling my fiduciary duties." "But you don't understand the complexities of modern business operations," David insisted. "Some of these decisions require expertise you don't have." I gathered my papers and stood up from the table. "Then perhaps it's time for me to acquire that expertise. I'm considering hiring an independent business consultant to review our operations and make recommendations for improved oversight." David's reaction was swift and alarmed. "That's not necessary," I can provide you with any information you need. You've had several opportunities to provide information today, I pointed out. Your responses have been incomplete or evasive. An independent review would give me confidence that the company is being managed in my best interests. As I left the Henley manufacturing offices, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. Not only had I demonstrated my competence publicly, but I had also gathered evidence of questionable business practices that explained why David was so eager to have me declared incompetent. If I couldn't ask inconvenient questions about company operations, his financial irregularities would remain hidden. Saturday brought an invitation to lunch from Helen Ashford, but when I arrived at her house, I discovered she had invited two other neighbors, Patricia Wells and Dorothy Martinez. Both women had known me for years through various community activities, and their immediate warmth contradicted any suggestion that I was becoming confused or difficult to be around. "Maggie, you look wonderful," Patricia said as we settled in Helen's sunroom with chicken salad sandwiches and iced tea. "Much more like your old self than you did right after Charles passed." Dorothy nodded in agreement. "Grief can be so isolating. It's good to see you engaging with people again." Helen had clearly arranged this gathering to provide me with social witnesses to my competence, and I was grateful for her thoughtfulness. As we chatted about community events, book recommendations, and local news, I realized how much I had missed these normal interactions with peers who saw me as an intelligent, capable adult. "I've been meaning to ask," Patricia said. "Are you still planning to attend the library's annual fundraising gala next month? Your support has always been so important to that event." I had completely forgotten about the gala, one of Millbrook's premier social events and a cause I had supported generously for years. "Absolutely," I said. "In fact, I'd like to increase my involvement this year. Perhaps sponsor a table or contribute to the silent auction." Dorothy's eyes brightened. "That would be wonderful. The library is trying to raise funds for digital archive preservation, and major donors like you make such a difference." The conversation reminded me how many community connections I had allowed to lapse during my period of grief and family stress. These were relationships with people who knew me well and valued my contributions. Their perspectives on my capabilities carried more weight than family members who stood to benefit from portraying me as incompetent. Sunday evening, I called Jonathan Sterling at home to update him on the week's developments. He listened with interest as I described the board meeting, the scholarship committee appointment, and the social interactions that demonstrated my ongoing competence. "Excellent work," he said. "You're building a strong public record of your capabilities. Have there been any new incidents with your family?" I described David's reaction to my increased involvement in company oversight and his growing resistance to my questions about business operations. Jonathan made notes as I spoke, particularly about the revelation of contracts with Caroline's family members. "That's potentially significant," he said. "If David has been using company resources to benefit his wife's family without proper disclosure, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. It also provides a clear motive for wanting you removed from oversight responsibilities." "What should I do about it?" I asked. "Document everything, but don't confront him directly yet," Jonathan advised. "We want to gather complete information before taking any action. In the meantime, continue demonstrating your competence and independence. The more public evidence we have of your capabilities, the stronger your position becomes." Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Dr. Harrison, the geriatric psychiatrist Tommy had brought to my house the previous week. His voice was professional but persistent as he explained that he was calling to follow up on our conversation. "Mrs. Henley, I've been thinking about our discussion, and I'm concerned that you may not be aware of some subtle cognitive changes that could affect your safety and decision-making abilities." I listened carefully as he described his supposed observations, taking notes for my files. According to Dr. Harrison, I had demonstrated poor insight into my limitations, defensive responses to appropriate questions, and unrealistic assessments of my capabilities. These were exactly the kinds of clinical observations that could be used to support a petition for guardianship. "Dr. Harrison," I said when he finished, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite confident in my cognitive abilities. If formal testing is needed, I'd prefer to arrange it through my own physician." "Sometimes families are better judges of cognitive changes than the individuals experiencing them," he replied. "Your son Tommy is genuinely worried about you, and his observations are consistent with early-stage dementia or mild cognitive impairment." The diagnosis was delivered casually, as if he were discussing the weather rather than making a pronouncement. That could be used to strip away my legal rights. I realized this phone call was likely being recorded, creating documentation of his clinical concerns that could be presented as evidence of my incompetence. "I understand Tommy's concerns," I said carefully, "but I don't share his assessment of my abilities. If he believes formal evaluation is necessary, I'm open to discussing it with my regular physician." Dr. Harrison pressed harder, explaining that early intervention was crucial for cognitive disorders, and that delay could result in rapid deterioration. His persistence suggested he was trying to create urgency around getting me into treatment for conditions I didn't have. After I declined his offers to arrange immediate evaluation and treatment, Dr. Harrison's tone became more ominous. "Mrs. Henley, I feel obligated to document my concerns about your mental state. If something happens to you because appropriate intervention was delayed, I want it clear that professional recommendations were made and declined." The threat was unmistakable. He was creating a paper trail that could be used to support claims that I had been offered appropriate medical care, but was too cognitively impaired to accept it. I ended the call politely but firmly, then immediately called Jonathan Sterling to report the conversation. "This is escalating quickly," Jonathan said after I described Dr. Harrison's call. "He's trying to establish medical grounds for intervention. We need to accelerate our defensive strategies." That afternoon, I met with Grace Chen, the financial advisor Jonathan had recommended to review my investment decisions and money management capabilities. Grace's office was in the same building as Jonathan's firm, and her credentials were impeccable: MBA from Wharton, certified financial planner designation, and 20 years of experience managing portfolios for high-net-worth clients. Grace spent 2 hours reviewing my financial records, investment decisions, and budgeting practices. She examined my bank statements, investment portfolio performance, and bill-paying patterns with the thoroughness of someone conducting a formal competency evaluation. "Mrs. Henley," she said as we concluded, "your financial management is exemplary. Your investment decisions show careful consideration of risk and return. Your budgeting is realistic and well-organized. Your bill-paying is timely and accurate. I see no evidence of poor financial judgment or inability to manage complex financial matters." Relief washed over me, though I had been confident in Grace's assessment. "Would you be willing to document that opinion formally?" "Absolutely," Grace replied. "In fact, I'd like to suggest that we establish a formal advisory relationship, not because you need financial management, but because having an independent professional reviewing your decisions regularly would provide additional protection against any future challenges to your competence." The arrangement made perfect sense. Regular meetings with Grace would create ongoing documentation of my sound financial judgment while providing professional oversight that demonstrated my commitment to responsible money management. Tuesday evening brought the monthly meeting of my book club, hosted this month by Patricia Wells. 8 women had gathered to discuss our latest selection, a complex literary novel that had generated passionate discussions about themes of aging, independence, and family relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were debating these very issues while my own family questioned my ability to make decisions about my life. During our discussion, I found myself contributing insights and analysis that demonstrated not only cognitive sharpness, but also emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills. When Sarah Mitchell mentioned challenges she was facing with her adult children's opinions about her living situation, several women shared similar experiences. It's remarkable how quickly adult children can decide their parents are incapable of making good decisions, observed Louise Chen, a retired professor. Sometimes I think they're projecting their own anxieties about aging onto us. Margaret Thompson nodded vigorously. My daughter wants me to stop driving, even though I've never had an accident and my vision and reflexes are fine. She's convinced I'm a danger to myself and others, but I think she's the one with the problem. The conversation that followed revealed that several women in our group had faced similar pressures from well-meaning but controlling adult children. Their stories provided perspective on my own situation while demonstrating that what I was experiencing wasn't unusual or necessarily motivated by genuine concern. After the book club meeting, Patricia walked me to my car and spoke quietly about what she'd observed during our discussion. Maggie, I don't know what your family has been telling you about your mental sharpness, but based on tonight's conversation, you're as intellectually engaged and thoughtful as you've ever been. Your analysis of the novel was sophisticated, your comments about family dynamics were insightful, and your memory for details from previous books we've discussed was excellent. Her unsolicited assessment meant more to me than she could know. Patricia was a retired elementary school principal who had spent 30 years evaluating cognitive development and learning capabilities. Her professional opinion carried significant weight. Wednesday morning brought a call from Martha Blackwood at the Community Foundation with news that validated my return to public engagement. The scholarship committee's preliminary review of applications had gone exceptionally well, and my evaluations of candidate qualifications had been particularly thorough and insightful. Maggie, your scoring rubric for academic potential was brilliant, Martha said enthusiastically. You identified several candidates who might have been overlooked using our previous evaluation methods. The committee unanimously agreed to adopt your assessment framework for future scholarship reviews. The recognition felt wonderful, but more importantly, it created professional documentation of my analytical abilities and judgment. My work with the scholarship committee would be reviewed by other foundation board members and eventually by the recipients themselves. It was exactly the kind of public demonstration of competence that Jonathan had encouraged me to pursue. Thursday. Afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Frank Morrison, the independent board member from Henley Manufacturing who had supported my questions about vendor selection policies. He called ahead to request a brief meeting, claiming he had concerns about company operations that he wanted to discuss privately. Frank was a man Charles had deeply respected, a retired bank president with 40 years of experience in business and finance. His perspective on company management carried considerable weight, and his request for a private meeting suggested he had observed something troubling during Friday's board meeting. Maggie, he said as we settled in my living room, I've been thinking about the questions you raised at the board meeting, and I believe your concerns about financial oversight are well-founded. Frank proceeded to outline irregularities he had noticed in company operations over the past year, patterns that had troubled him but that he hadn't felt comfortable addressing when David was clearly being supported by his mother's apparent disengagement. The consulting contracts you questioned are just the tip of the iceberg, Frank explained. I've identified at least 6 vendors with family connections to David or Caroline. The travel expenses include trips that seem more personal than business-related. And the professional services fees are going to firms that don't appear to be providing commensurate value. My suspicions were being confirmed by an independent, highly qualified observer. Frank's willingness to document his concerns provided crucial support for my growing conviction that David had been taking advantage of my grief-related withdrawal from company oversight to enrich himself and his in-laws at company expense. What do you recommend? I asked. Frank's response was immediate and decisive. Independent audit. Full. Financial review by a firm with no connections to David or the current management team. The irregularities I've identified could represent significant financial losses to the company. We spent an hour discussing audit firms and review procedures, with Frank offering to help coordinate the process to ensure complete independence and thoroughness. His support felt like a lifeline, validation that my concerns were reasonable, and my oversight responsibilities were important. As Frank prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Maggie, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but there's nothing wrong with your mental sharpness. Your questions at the board meeting were exactly the right ones to ask, and your insistence on proper documentation showed excellent business judgment. Anyone suggesting otherwise either doesn't understand business oversight or has reasons for wanting you to withdraw from active management." His words crystallized something I had been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. My family's attacks on my competence weren't random or motivated by genuine medical concerns. They were strategic, designed to neutralize my ability to exercise oversight over business and financial matters that they preferred to control without interference. That evening, as I updated my journal with the day's events, I realized how dramatically my situation had changed over the past week. 7 days ago, I had been defending myself against accusations of cognitive decline while quietly gathering evidence of my competence. Now I was actively demonstrating my capabilities in multiple public forums while uncovering evidence of my family's financial misconduct. The transformation felt empowering, but it also felt dangerous. The more competent I appeared publicly, the more desperate my family might become to establish their narrative of my incapacity. Dr. Harrison's phone call had already escalated their efforts, and I suspected worse was coming. But I was no longer the confused, grieving widow who had allowed others to question her perceptions and capabilities. I was Margaret Henley, successful businesswoman, community leader, and sharp-minded strategist who remembered every slight, every manipulation, and every attempt to undermine her autonomy. Let them escalate. I was ready. The confrontation I had been anticipating came sooner than expected, triggered by my decision to hire Westbrook and Associates to conduct an independent audit of Henley Manufacturing. When David learned about the audit on Monday morning, his reaction was swift and revealing. He called me at 8:30, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Mother, I just received a call from some audit firm claiming you've authorized them to review our financial records. This is completely inappropriate and unnecessary." I remained calm, stirring my morning coffee as I spoke. As the owner of the company, I have every right to request an independent financial review. Frank Morrison and I discussed it extensively, and we both believe it's prudent. Frank Morrison has no authority to make decisions about company audits, David snapped. And you don't understand the disruption this will cause to our operations. Then you should have nothing to worry about, I replied evenly. Legitimate business operations withstand scrutiny quite well. There was a pause, and when David spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on the tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable with someone incapable of understanding complex situations. "Mother, I'm concerned about your judgment lately. This audit decision is impulsive and shows poor understanding of business practices. Combined with your other erratic behavior, I think it's time we seriously discussed getting you some help." The word erratic caught my attention. It suggested he had been building a vocabulary around my supposed instability, preparing descriptions that would sound clinical and concerning to medical professionals or legal authorities. "What specific behavior do you consider erratic?" I asked. David seemed prepared for this question. "The sudden interest in company operations you've never cared about before. The suspicious questioning of legitimate business decisions. The withdrawal from family activities. The inappropriate spending on consultants and advisors. The refusal to consider assisted living despite obvious signs that you need support." Each accusation was crafted to sound reasonable while misrepresenting the facts. My sudden interest in company operations was actually responsible oversight of assets I had inherited. My suspicious questioning involved asking for documentation of expenditures involving family members. My withdrawal from family activities meant declining to participate in discussions about surrendering my independence. My inappropriate spending consisted of hiring professionals to protect my interests. I see, I said carefully. And who else shares these concerns about my behavior? We all do, David said. Tommy, Victoria, Caroline, even Dr. Harrison. Everyone who cares about you can see that something is wrong. The phrase, everyone who cares about you, was particularly manipulative, suggesting that anyone who didn't see problems with my behavior simply didn't care enough to notice. It was a classic isolation tactic, designed to make me feel that reasonable people shared their assessment of my decline. I appreciate everyone's concern, I said diplomatically, but I'm confident in my decision-making abilities. David's patience evaporated. Your confidence is part of the problem. You're losing insight into your own limitations. Dr. Harrison explained that lack of awareness is one of the early signs of cognitive impairment. So Dr. Harrison had already provided David with clinical language to describe my resistance to their control efforts. The lack of insight diagnosis was particularly insidious because it suggested that any disagreement with their assessment proved their point. I think we should continue this conversation when you've had time to calm down, I said. Don't patronize me, David shot back. This isn't about being calm. This is about you making destructive decisions that could harm the family business Dad spent 40 years building. The reference to Charles was designed to make me feel guilty about betraying his legacy, but it had the opposite effect. Charles had built Henley Manufacturing with integrity and transparency. The practices David was defending would have appalled his father. Your father would have insisted on proper financial oversight, I said firmly. He never would have approved sole source contracts with family members or unexplained expense increases. You don't know what Dad would have wanted, David said, his voice rising. You never understood the business side of his work. This was historically inaccurate. I had been Charles's closest advisor on major business decisions throughout our marriage, often helping him think through strategic challenges and financial commitments. David was rewriting history to support his narrative that I had never been competent to understand business matters. I think this conversation has become unproductive, I said. The audit will proceed as scheduled. David's response was immediate and threatening. If you insist on this destructive course, don't expect the family to support you when you face the consequences. Tommy and I have been trying to protect you, but if you're determined to make reckless decisions, we may have to consider other options. The threat was clear. Comply with their wishes or face more aggressive intervention. I ended the call without responding, but my hands were shaking as I set down the phone. The confrontation had revealed the extent of their coordination and the clinical language they were prepared to use against me. Within an hour, Tommy called to request an emergency family meeting. His voice was gentler than David's, but the urgency was unmistakable. Mom, David told me about your conversation this morning. I think we need to sit down together and talk about what's been happening. What do you think has been happening? I asked. Tommy's response was carefully prepared, suggesting he and David had rehearsed this conversation. You've been making some concerning decisions lately that seem out of character. The audit, the increased involvement in company operations, the resistance to reasonable suggestions about your living situation. We're worried that you might be experiencing some cognitive changes that are affecting your judgment. The phrase, cognitive changes that are affecting your judgment, was precisely the language that would appear in medical evaluations and legal documents. Tommy was building a clinical record of my supposed decline using terminology that would sound authoritative to courts and healthcare providers. I don't believe my judgment is impaired, I said. But that's what worries us, Tommy replied. People experiencing cognitive decline often don't recognize the changes themselves. It's called anosognosia, and it's very common in early-stage dementia. The casual use of medical terminology was chilling. Tommy was diagnosing me with a specific symptom of dementia based solely on my disagreement with his assessment of my capabilities. Any resistance to their control efforts could be reframed as neurological evidence of impairment. Has Dr. Harrison suggested I have dementia? I asked directly. Tommy hesitated before answering. He's expressed concerns about cognitive changes that warrant further evaluation. He thinks you should have comprehensive neuropsychological testing and possibly start on medications that could slow the progression. This was precisely what I had expected. Dr. Harrison was prepared to diagnose dementia and recommend treatment based on my refusal to accept their assessment of my incapacity. The medications he wanted to prescribe could actually impair cognitive function, creating the very problems they claim to be treating. I'm not interested in medications for conditions I don't have, I said firmly. But how do you know you don't have them? Tommy pressed. You're not qualified to make that determination yourself. The logic was circular and designed to trap me. If I insisted I was competent, that proved I lacked insight into my impairment. If I acknowledged any confusion or uncertainty, that confirmed their diagnosis. There was no response I could give that wouldn't be interpreted as evidence supporting their narrative. I think we should have this family meeting, I said finally, but I'd like Helen Ashford to be present as a neutral observer. Tommy's reaction was immediate and negative. This is a private family matter. Having outsiders present would be inappropriate and could make the discussion more difficult. His objection revealed their strategy. They wanted to isolate me from potential allies who might question their assessment or provide alternative perspectives on my behavior. Helen's presence would prevent them from making unchallenged claims about my competence. Helen has been a close family friend for 20 years, I pointed out. Her presence would hardly be inappropriate. But she's not qualified to assess cognitive function, Tommy argued. This discussion needs to focus on medical and safety concerns that require professional evaluation. They wanted to frame the meeting as a medical intervention rather than a family discussion, positioning themselves as qualified to make clinical assessments while dismissing any contrary opinions as uninformed. I agreed to the meeting, but insisted it take place in my home rather than a location they controlled. Tuesday afternoon, the family gathered in my living room with the solemnity of people conducting an intervention. David, Caroline, Tommy, and Victoria arranged themselves strategically around the room, their positioning suggesting they had planned their approach carefully. I sat in Charles's chair, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings. David began with what sounded like a prepared statement. Mother, we're here because we love you, and we're concerned about changes we've all observed in your behavior and decision-making over the past few months. He proceeded to outline their collective assessment of my decline, presenting incidents and observations that painted a picture of progressive cognitive impairment. Their narrative was comprehensive and damning. Memory lapses, poor judgment, social withdrawal, financial irresponsibility, and lack of insight into my own limitations. What made their presentation particularly sophisticated was how they had coordinated their observations. Each family member contributed specific examples that supported the overall narrative, creating the impression of independent confirmation rather than collaborative fabrication. Caroline described my confusion during recent conversations, my inappropriate responses to reasonable suggestions, and my defensive reactions to legitimate concerns. Victoria detailed my supposed struggles with household management, my forgetfulness about social commitments, and my erratic behavior during family visits. Tommy provided medical context for their observations, explaining how the incidents they described aligned with early-stage dementia symptoms. He used clinical terminology throughout his presentation, lending professional authority to their amateur psychological assessment. When they finished, the room fell silent as they waited for my response. I looked at each of them carefully, These people who claim to love me while systematically undermining my autonomy and dignity. I've listened to your concerns, I said. Finally, now I'd like to share some observations of my own. I opened the journal I had brought with me and began reading from my detailed records of our interactions over the past month. I recounted conversations verbatim, demonstrating not only that my memory was intact, but that their descriptions of events often contradicted what had actually occurred. When Caroline claimed I had been confused about her sister's wedding plans, I read her exact words from our dinner conversation, proving that she had indeed discussed the engagement party in detail. When David insisted I had agreed to consider outside management for Henley Manufacturing, I quoted his actual proposal in my response, showing that I had only agreed to review additional information. As I continued reading from my journal, their expressions shifted from confidence to concern to alarm. They had not expected me to have detailed documentation of their manipulation tactics, and my precise recall of conversations they thought I had forgotten undermined their entire narrative. "You see," I said when I finished, "my memory works quite well enough to remember every accusation you've made, every threat you've implied, and every attempt to convince me that I'm losing my mental faculties." David recovered first, attempting to reframe my documentation as evidence of obsessive behavior. "Mother, keeping detailed records of family conversations isn't normal. It suggests paranoia and an inability to trust the people who care about you most." Tommy nodded, in agreement. "The hypervigilance you're describing is actually consistent with early cognitive changes. People experiencing mental decline often become suspicious of family members who are trying to help them." Their ability to pathologize any evidence of my competence was remarkable. Clear memory became obsessive record-keeping. Appropriate skepticism became paranoid hypervigilance. Self-advocacy became lack of insight into limitations. "What specifically are you asking me to do?" I said. Caroline leaned forward, her voice taking on that familiar patronizing tone. "We want you to have a comprehensive evaluation by Dr. Harrison and his team. If there are problems, we can address them early. If there aren't, you'll have professional confirmation that you're fine." The offer sounded reasonable, but I understood the trap. Dr. Harrison had already demonstrated his willingness to find problems where none existed. His comprehensive evaluation would provide clinical documentation of impairment that could be used to support guardianship proceedings. "I'm not comfortable being evaluated by Dr. Harrison," I said. "If evaluation is necessary, I'll arrange it through my own physician." David's frustration was visible. Dr. Harrison is a specialist in cognitive disorders. Dr. Meadows is just a general practitioner. She's not qualified to assess complex mental health issues. "Then I'll ask Dr. Meadows to refer me to an appropriate specialist," I replied. "But time is critical," Tommy pressed. "Dr. Harrison has explained that early intervention can make a significant difference in outcomes. Delaying proper evaluation could mean missing the window for effective treatment." They were creating artificial urgency to pressure me into accepting their chosen evaluator. The implication was that my preference for independent assessment could have dire medical consequences, making my resistance seem selfish and dangerous. Victoria tried a different approach, focusing on practical concerns rather than medical ones. "Maggie, even if you don't have cognitive problems, the stress of managing everything alone must be overwhelming. Wouldn't it be nice to have support with daily decisions and household management?" Her suggestion sounded caring, but it revealed their ultimate goal, removing my independence regardless of my actual capabilities. Whether I was competent or impaired, they wanted me under supervision and control. "I don't find managing my own life overwhelming," I said. "I find it empowering." The word seemed to startle them, as if my desire for autonomy was unexpected and inappropriate. Caroline's response was swift and telling. "At your age, empowerment is less important than safety and security. Pride shouldn't prevent you from accepting help when you need it." The ageism in her comment was blatant. She was suggesting that elderly people should prioritize safety over autonomy, accepting supervision even if they didn't need it simply because they had reached a certain age. "I'll determine what I need and when I need it," I said firmly. David stood up abruptly, his patience exhausted. "This is exactly what Dr. Harrison warned us about. You're so convinced you're fine that you can't see the obvious signs of decline. This lack of insight is dangerous." Tommy rose as well, his expression troubled. "Mom, if you won't accept evaluation voluntarily, we may have to consider other options. We can't stand by and watch you make decisions that could harm yourself or others." The threat was explicit now. Submit to their preferred evaluation or face involuntary intervention. They were prepared to use legal mechanisms to override my autonomy if I continued to resist their control efforts. "What other options?" I asked calmly. The family exchanged glances before David answered. "Petition for guardianship. If we can. Demonstrate that you're no longer competent to make safe decisions about your care and finances. A court can appoint someone to manage your affairs." There it was, the ultimate goal revealed. They wanted legal authority to control my assets, my living situation, and my medical care. The assisted living placement, the medical evaluation, the concerns about my competence were all steps toward gaining guardianship over me and my estate. "And who would serve as my guardian?" I asked. "We would," Tommy said. "David and I would share responsibility for making sure you're properly cared for." The euphemism was telling. Properly cared for meant managed according to their preferences, rather than mine. They would have legal authority to override any decisions I made about my life, my money, or my future. Caroline attempted to soften the threat with false reassurance. "Maggie, guardianship doesn't mean you lose all independence. It just means having professional oversight to ensure your decisions are safe and appropriate." But I understood guardianship, law better than they realized. A person under guardianship loses fundamental rights, including the ability to make financial decisions, choose where to live, consent to medical treatment, and enter into contracts. It was legal incapacitation, not professional oversight. "I see," I said quietly. "And if I refuse to cooperate with this guardianship petition?" David's answer was blunt. "Then we'll have to demonstrate your incompetence through other means." Dr. Harrison is prepared to testify about his clinical observations. "We have documented examples of poor judgment and memory problems. The court will decide whether you're capable of managing your own affairs." They had prepared for every contingency. If I submitted to their preferred evaluation, Dr. Harrison would find evidence of impairment. If I refused evaluation, my resistance would be presented as proof of lack of insight. If I sought independent assessment, they would argue that delay was dangerous and that I was doctor shopping to avoid legitimate medical findings. "I think this meeting has served its purpose," I said, standing up from Charles's chair. "You've made your position clear." Victoria tried one last appeal to emotion. "Maggie, we're not your enemies. We're your family, and we love you. Everything we're asking is for your own good." The manipulation was subtle but effective, designed to make me feel guilty for resisting their efforts and unreasonable for questioning their motives. But I had moved beyond guilt and self-doubt. "If you loved me," I said quietly, "you would respect my autonomy and support my decisions, even if you disagreed with them. What you're describing isn't love, it's control." As they filed out of my house, I could hear them talking in urgent whispers on my front porch. They had expected compliance or confusion, not clear-eyed resistance backed by detailed documentation of their manipulation tactics. Their intervention had failed, which meant they would need to escalate their efforts. That evening, I called Jonathan Sterling to report on the family meeting and the explicit threat of guardianship proceedings. His response was immediate and reassuring. "They've overplayed their hand," he said. Threatening guardianship in response to reasonable business oversight makes their motives look suspect. We need to move quickly to establish your competence before they can file any petitions. We scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning to review our defensive strategy and prepare for potential legal action. I also called Dr. Richardson to request expedited copies of my neuropsychological evaluation and Frank Morrison to update him on the family's threats. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically the situation had escalated. What had begun as subtle undermining of my confidence had evolved into explicit threats of legal incapacitation. But their aggressive tactics had also revealed the desperation behind their campaign. They needed me declared incompetent quickly, before the audit revealed their financial misconduct, and before my public demonstrations of competence became too well established to ignore. Their timeline was compressed, which meant they would likely make mistakes that could be used against them. I pulled out my journal and began writing a detailed account of the family meeting, recording every threat, every clinical term they had used, and every manipulation tactic they had employed. If they wanted to question my memory, I would give them something substantial to remember. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, I was no longer the confused, grieving widow they had been manipulating for months. I was Margaret, Henley, and I remembered everything they had said and done. Every cruel word, every false accusation, every attempt to steal my independence and dignity. They thought my memory was failing, but they were about to discover exactly how much I remembered when I rewrote my will. Wednesday morning, I walked into Jonathan Sterling's office with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The time for defensive strategies and cautious maneuvering had passed. My family had shown their true intentions, and now it was time to show them mine. "They've forced our hand," Jonathan said after I briefed him on the previous day's confrontation. "Threatening guardianship proceedings changes everything. We need to file preemptive legal actions before they can move forward with their petition." Within 2 hours, we had drafted a comprehensive response strategy. Jonathan would file for a restraining order preventing my family from accessing my medical records or speaking with healthcare providers about my condition without my consent. We would also initiate a formal complaint against Dr. Harrison with the state medical board for attempting to diagnose and treat a patient he had never formally examined. But the centerpiece of our strategy was something far more devastating: a complete revision of my estate planning documents that would strip away every financial incentive my family had for declaring me incompetent. If they succeed in gaining guardianship, Jonathan explained, they'll control your assets during your lifetime. But they can't change your will or control what happens after your death unless you're declared incompetent at the time you execute new documents. We need to create a new will immediately, while your competence is clearly established. The new will I dictated that morning was a masterpiece of strategic disinheritance. David and Tommy would receive minimal bequests, enough to demonstrate that I hadn't simply forgotten them, but small enough to eliminate any financial motivation for controlling my affairs. The bulk of my estate would go to charitable organizations, with specific provisions ensuring that Henley Manufacturing would be sold to its employees rather than inherited by my sons. Most importantly, the will included detailed explanations for my decisions. I documented their attempts to have me declared incompetent, their financial misconduct at the company, and their systematic campaign to undermine my autonomy. Future legal challenges to my competence would have to contend with my clear, detailed explanation of exactly why I had disinherited them. "This is brilliant," Jonathan said as we reviewed the final document. "Even if they somehow succeed in having you declared incompetent later, this will was executed while your competence was thoroughly documented. Courts are extremely reluctant to overturn wills based on retroactive competency challenges, especially when the testator has explained their reasoning so clearly." Thursday brought news that the Westbrook audit had uncovered exactly what Frank Morrison and I had suspected. David had authorized payments totaling over $400,000 to vendors with undisclosed family connections. Travel expenses, included personal vacations charged to company accounts. Professional services fees had gone to Caroline's relatives for work that was never performed or poorly documented. Frank called me personally to deliver the preliminary findings. "Maggie, this is worse than we thought. David has essentially been treating Henley Manufacturing as his personal bank account. The board needs to meet immediately to address these irregularities." An emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, giving David less than 24 hours to prepare his defense. When Frank called to inform him of the meeting, David's reaction was predictably hostile. "This audit is a witch hunt, orchestrated by my mother's paranoid delusions," he told Frank, according to the notes Frank shared with me. "She's not mentally competent to make business decisions, and this entire process should be invalidated." But David's protests rang hollow when confronted with documented evidence of financial misconduct. The board meeting on Friday was swift and decisive. Presented with the audit findings, the independent board members voted unanimously to terminate David's employment and pursue recovery of misappropriated funds. David's final act of desperation came that afternoon when he appeared at my house with Caroline and a man I didn't recognize. The stranger introduced himself as Robert Whitmore, the family's attorney, and his presence suggested they were preparing to escalate their legal threats. "Mrs. Henley," Whitmore said after I reluctantly invited them into my living room, "your family has asked me to discuss some concerns they have about your recent behavior and decision-making." I remained standing, making it clear this would be a brief conversation. "What concerns?" Whitmore consulted a legal pad covered with notes. "Erratic business decisions that have damaged family relationships and company operations. Unjustified termination of your son from his position at Henley Manufacturing. Sudden changes to financial arrangements without consultation with family members who would be affected. Resistance to appropriate medical evaluation despite obvious signs of cognitive decline." Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound like legitimate grounds for guardianship proceedings. They were creating a legal record of my supposed incompetence that could be presented to a court as evidence justifying intervention. "Mr. Whitmore," I said calmly, "I assume you've reviewed the audit findings that led to David's termination?" Whitmore looked uncomfortable. "I understand there were some irregularities, but your response was disproportionate and suggests impaired judgment." I walked to Charles's desk and retrieved a copy of the audit report, setting it on the coffee table in front of Whitmore. $400,000 in unauthorized payments to family members represents more than irregularities. It represents breach of fiduciary duty and potential embezzlement. As Whitmore reviewed the document, his expression shifted from confidence to concern. The audit findings were damning, and David's termination was clearly justified by objective evidence of financial misconduct. "Mrs. Henley," he said carefully, "these allegations will need to be investigated thoroughly before any conclusions can be drawn." "The investigation has been completed," I replied, "by independent auditors with impeccable credentials. David was terminated for cause based on documented evidence of financial impropriety." Caroline attempted to redirect the conversation. "Maggie, the financial issues are secondary to our concerns about your health. Dr. Harrison has identified serious cognitive problems that need immediate attention." I had been waiting for this moment, the opportunity to reveal just how thoroughly I had documented their manipulation campaign. I retrieved my journal from Charles's desk and opened it to a marked page. Dr. Harrison conducted an informal evaluation during a 20-minute conversation in my living room. I read from my notes. He then called me unsolicited to claim I was suffering from early-stage dementia based solely on that brief interaction. He offered to arrange immediate treatment for conditions he diagnosed without formal testing or proper clinical protocols. I continued reading, detailing Dr. Harrison's willingness to find cognitive problems where none existed and his apparent coordination with my family to build a case for my incompetence. Whitmore listened with growing alarm as I documented the systematic nature of their campaign. Furthermore, I continued, I have undergone comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by Dr. Amanda Richardson, an independent specialist with no connection to my family. Her assessment found no evidence of cognitive impairment and confirmed my capacity to make complex decisions about my care, finances, and living situation. I handed Whitmore a copy of Dr. Richardson's report, watching his expression as he absorbed the implications. His clients had built their entire case on the diagnosis of a psychiatrist who was willing to make clinical findings without proper evaluation, while I had objective evidence of cognitive competence from a respected independent specialist. David's face had grown progressively redder as I spoke. "Mother, you've been planning this," he said accusingly. "All the documentation, the recordings, the legal maneuvering. This isn't the behavior of someone with normal cognitive function." His logic was desperate and self-defeating. The very evidence that demonstrated my mental sharpness was being presented as proof of impairment. But Whitmore clearly understood the weakness of this argument. "Mrs. Henley," Whitmore said, standing up from the couch, "I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your situation. Perhaps we should reconsider the approach we've been discussing." Caroline looked stricken. "Robert, we've explained the problems we've observed, the memory issues, the poor judgment, the paranoid behavior. What I'm observing," Whitmore replied carefully, "is a woman who has thoroughly documented concerning behavior by family members and has taken appropriate steps to protect her interests. That doesn't suggest impaired judgment. It suggests exactly the opposite." David's desperation reached a crescendo. "She's manipulated you just like she's manipulated everyone else. The community foundation, the book club, even Frank Morrison. She's convinced them all that she's fine when we can see she's clearly declining." But Whitmore was already gathering his papers. "David, I can't proceed with guardianship proceedings based on the evidence I've seen today. Mrs. Henley has demonstrated clear thinking, appropriate documentation of her concerns, and sound decision-making regarding her business and personal affairs. No court would find her incompetent based on what you've described." As the three of them prepared to leave, I delivered the final blow that would ensure they understood the futility of continuing their campaign. "Before you go," I said calmly, "there's something you should know. I've executed a new will that reflects my assessment of our family relationships and my experience over the past few months." The room fell silent. David's face went pale as the implications sank in. "What does that mean?" Caroline asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "It means that your efforts to control my assets and have me declared incompetent have eliminated any financial benefit you might have gained from my death," I replied. "The bulk of my estate will go to charitable organizations that actually serve the public good, rather than family members who see me as a source of income to be managed and manipulated." Tommy, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke. "Mom, you can't be serious. We're your children." "Yes," I said sadly. "You are my children. And you've spent the past month trying to have me declared legally incompetent so you could control my money and my life. That's not something I can forgive or forget." David's composure finally cracked entirely. "You vindictive old woman. We were trying to help you and you've turned it into some paranoid fantasy about us stealing your money. The audit findings suggest your concern about my money was quite real," I replied. $400,000 worth of concern, to be precise. Whitmore was already moving toward the door, clearly eager to distance himself from clients whose legal position had collapsed so thoroughly. "Mrs. Henley, I apologize for any misunderstanding. David, Caroline, I think we should discuss this situation privately." After they left, I sat in Charles's chair and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. I had successfully defended myself against a coordinated campaign to strip away my autonomy and dignity. More than that, I had turned their own tactics against them using their accusations and manipulations as evidence of their true motivations. The phone rang within an hour. It was Tommy, calling without David or Caroline present for the first time in weeks. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I need to apologize. I let David convince me that you were having problems, and I went along with things I should have questioned." I listened as he struggled to explain his role in the conspiracy against me. "I really believed you were declining," he said. "David was so convinced, and Dr. Harrison seemed so certain. I thought I was helping protect you." "Tommy," I said gently, "do you understand why I can't trust that judgment anymore? You were willing to have me declared legally incompetent based on secondhand observations and the opinion of a psychiatrist who spent 20 minutes in my living room." "I know," he admitted. "I realize now how wrong that was. Is there any way to repair the damage I've caused?" His question was heartbreaking because it demonstrated genuine remorse, something I hadn't heard from David or Caroline. But the trust between us had been shattered by his willingness to participate in their scheme. "I don't know," I said honestly. "You were prepared to take away my fundamental rights as a human being. That's not something I can easily forget." "The will," he said quietly. "Is it really final?" "It reflects my current assessment of our relationship," I replied. "Whether that changes depends on whether you can demonstrate that you respect my autonomy and independence, not just tolerate them when they're convenient." Saturday morning brought a call from Helen Ashford, who had learned about the confrontation through the efficient Millbrook gossip network. She arrived within an hour with a bottle of champagne and a fierce smile. "Maggie Henley," she said, embracing me warmly. "You magnificent woman. I always knew you had steel in your spine, but what you did to those manipulative children of yours was absolutely brilliant." We spent the afternoon reviewing everything that had happened, from David's initial attempts at financial control through the final confrontation that had ended their guardianship threats. Helen listened with growing admiration as I described the strategic documentation, the professional evaluations, and the legal maneuvering that had protected my independence. "You know what I admire most?" Helen said as we finished our champagne. "You never lost sight of who you were. They tried to convince you that you were confused and incompetent, but you trusted your own perceptions even when everyone around you was telling you they were wrong." Sunday brought unexpected validation from Dr. Patricia Meadows, my longtime physician, who called after learning about the family's attempts to have me evaluated for cognitive problems. "Maggie," she said, "I understand there have been some concerns raised about your mental status. I want you to know that in my professional opinion, you demonstrate no signs of cognitive impairment. Your recent checkups have shown excellent mental clarity and appropriate decision-making capacity." Her unsolicited professional support felt like a warm embrace. "Dr. Harrison suggested you weren't qualified to assess cognitive function." Told her. Dr. Meadows' response was swift and angry. "Dr. Harrison is entitled to his opinion about my qualifications, but he's not entitled to diagnose my patients based on brief social interactions. What he did was professionally inappropriate and potentially harmful." Monday morning brought the final piece of my vindication. A letter from the state medical board informing me that they were opening a formal investigation into Dr. Harrison's conduct. His willingness to diagnose and recommend treatment for a patient he had never formally examined violated multiple professional standards. 2 weeks later, I attended the library fundraising gala as a major sponsor, appearing publicly as the competent, engaged community member I had always been. The evening was a triumph, not just socially, but personally. Everyone I spoke with treated me with the respect and warmth they always had, confirming that my family's concerns about my decline had never been shared by people who interacted with me regularly. Frank Morrison approached me during the silent auction, his expression warm with approval. "Maggie, I hope you know how much the business community respects what you did with the audit. Taking action to protect company integrity despite family pressure showed real leadership. His words meant more than he could know. I had worried that my actions might be seen as vindictive or petty, but the business community understood that I had fulfilled my responsibilities as a company owner by investigating and addressing financial misconduct. As the evening concluded, I reflected on the extraordinary month that had transformed my life so completely. I had begun as a grieving widow whose own children were questioning her mental capacity. I had ended as a woman who had successfully defended her autonomy, protected her assets, and exposed a conspiracy designed to rob her of both dignity and independence. The irony was perfect and complete. They had whispered about my failing memory at dinner tables and family gatherings, building a case for my incompetence based on manufactured evidence and biased observations. But I had remembered every word, every accusation, every manipulation tactic they had employed. When the time came to rewrite my will, my memory had proven devastatingly accurate. Every conversation I had documented, every threat I had recorded, every attempt to undermine my competence had become evidence of their true motives. They had questioned my memory, and my memory had provided the foundation for their complete defeat. Standing in my garden the next morning, tending to the roses Charles had planted for our anniversary, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since his death. The house was truly mine again. My independence was secure. My future would be determined by my own choices rather than other people's assumptions about my limitations. David and Caroline had moved out of state, unable to face the social consequences of their exposed manipulation campaign. Tommy continued to call occasionally, working slowly to rebuild the trust he had shattered. Whether our relationship could be salvaged remained to be seen, but it would only happen on terms that respected my autonomy and dignity. The Community Foundation had asked me to consider serving as board chair, recognizing leadership abilities my own family had dismissed as signs of decline. Henley Manufacturing, under new management, was thriving without the financial irregularities that had drained resources for David's benefit. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own perceptions again. The gaslighting campaign had been sophisticated and coordinated, designed to make me doubt my own memory and judgment. But I had held fast to my understanding of reality, even when everyone around me insisted I was wrong. As I worked among my roses, I thought about other elderly people who might be facing similar campaigns of manipulation and control. How many were questioning their own competence because family members found it convenient to portray them as declining? How many were surrendering their independence unnecessarily because they lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back? My story had ended in victory, but only because I had the financial means to hire legal representation, the education to understand my rights, and the social connections to provide alternative perspectives on my capabilities. Not everyone facing elder abuse would have those advantages. That afternoon, I called Jonathan Sterling to discuss establishing a legal clinic specifically designed to help elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation and inappropriate guardianship proceedings. My experience had taught me valuable lessons about recognizing and countering manipulation tactics, lessons that could benefit others facing similar challenges. The Margaret Henley Center for Elder Rights, Jonathan said thoughtfully. I like the sound of that. Your story could help countless people who are facing exactly what you went through. As evening fell, I sat in Charles's study, updating my journal one final time. The leather-bound book that had served as my primary weapon against those who questioned my memory was now a complete record of transformation from victim to victor. I wrote carefully, preserving every detail of the campaign that had been waged against me and the strategies that had ultimately defeated it. Future generations would read this account and understand that memory isn't just about recalling the past. Sometimes, memory becomes the foundation for building a better future. They had whispered about my failing memory, confident that their victim was too confused to remember their manipulation tactics. But I had remembered everything, and my memory had become their downfall. In the end, My supposedly failing memory had proven to be my greatest strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.